She called it thrift store chic, and the room laughed like it was a registered earthquake. It should have been a joke that died in the air, an ounce of office cruelty. Instead, it landed like a small, hot stone in Rebecca Hson's lap and kept rolling. Rebecca did not laugh. She did not jab back. She smiled the kind of smile that kept her mouth calm, while the rest of her tightened, tight like a drum. Her left hand, where the plain gold band had lived for 11 years, rested on a stack of printed slides. She thumbed the ring once, just enough for herself to feel it, as if remembering the metal made the world obey a different set of rules. Leela Lang's voice cut the bigger sound of the room, heels, a slide of chair, the hum of the projector, bright and aromatic the way a parrot's voice would be in a room full of polite people. "Honestly, Rebecca," she said, airbrushing every syllable, "that ring? It looks like thrift store chic. Is it a vintage thing?" She set the word vintage down as if it were a gift. Half the room snickered. The other half stared sideways, eyes calculating who would gain from picking a lane. Richard Lang took a measured sip of his coffee and pretended not to notice that his daughter was performing entitlement. He watched, like managers watch a quarterly graph, with the assumption that the worst of human behavior is predictable and therefore manageable. Rebecca felt the laugh pass over her like a draft. She had spent years learning how to let drafts slide past. Her work, operations, compliance, the quiet arithmetic of a firm that preferred its engines hidden, was the kind of labor that did not invite applause. It invited a spreadsheet and a checklist, and an invisible ironclad correction when something threatened to tilt the house. "And what's wrong with it being thrift store chic?" Leela said, radiant. "I mean, we're a modern firm. Image matters." Image. The word landed like another stone. Rebecca's slides glowed on the screen, full of numbers and projections and the kind of discrete levers she lived to tighten. None of that mattered to Leela's question. None of that mattered to the people who learned how to valorize bluster and mock the rest. Rebecca's voice, when it came, was smaller than anyone expected. "It's my father's," she said. The room stiffened. A single fluorescent flake of silence slid from the ceiling and stratified. People make jokes about things they think are empty. They stop when the thing proves not empty. Leela smiled the way a cat smiles at a closed door. "Your father," she said, like the information was quaint. "Did he, ship that in from somewhere dusty? It's minimal." "Edmund Hson," she said. The name crossed the room like a ship cutting a harbor. It did something understated. It made people rearrange how they sat in their chairs. There is a kind of power that exists in being known to a room in a single line.
Nobody present knew the whole of Edmund Hyson's history, not the missing parts, not the ledger he left behind like a hidden map. They knew the visible facts. He was a founder, once quietly influential. He had traveled into a private life that made press releases small and occasional. To Rebecca, the name carried parentheses, a ledger, a vanished man, and a promise that had been kept secret and heavy for 11 years. Leela's laugh was immediate and practiced. Right, how poetic. She threw up a hand and made a gesture like a TV host introducing scandal. But come on, we're talking branding. You can't... She glanced at Rebecca's plain band, then out at the group. You can't wear that and expect people to think you're, cutting edge. There is a particular fatigue to being mocked for your economy in a room whose people have never been faced with real restraint. Rebecca felt something colder than anger, a clarity like the kind you get when you correct an error in a dataset and watch the entire model snap into a different light. This was not about jewelry. Leela clapped, small and satisfied. "Anyway," she said, "back to Q4. The presentation resumed. Numbers slid across the screen. There was the predictable cascade of names, targets, key results, brand initiatives. But the room had changed its thermal profile. A low, curious hum threaded the slides now, sympathetic to the notion that someone like Leela, could publicly mock a person and not pay a price. If you're into corporate chaos, subscribe. This gets good. Rebecca closed the laptop lid with a soft click that sounded almost like a punctuation mark. She let the meeting finish with procedure's courtesy. She filed the deck and handed it to the coordinator who would upload it to the server. She signed the timesheet for the day. She did nothing dramatic. She did everything that had the effect of being invisible until it mattered. Her work back in her office was the kind of small surgical corrections that felt like mercy and like architecture at the same time. She fixed an invoice that had been rounded incorrectly across 3 ledgers, spotted a compliance flag nobody else had seen, and sent a terse email to a junior analyst explaining the error and how to avoid it next time. The analyst replied with gratitude, and then with a half-hearted emoji. Small fires put out are not the stuff of annual speeches, but they were her steady biography.
She thought about her father because the ring insisted she did. Edmund had put the band on her hand in the hospital hallway after an infusion and an apology. He had been a man of discreet gestures and louder absences. 11 years ago, 2 weeks after the market the company called transitional churn, he'd given her this ring and a folded, inked pledge he said he'd made once upon a time. He told her to wear it until there was a need to be known. There are things, he'd said in that rasp of a voice, that are only notice if you hold them visible.
People will ignore quiet until it's inconvenient. She had kept it hidden in plain sight, a plain gold band on a hand that wrote audit notes, reconciled balances, and answered late-night calls from operations. She had let the firm misname her contributions because being quiet bought her the vantage to read the ledger. You can't repair what you can't see until someone decides to look. Outside, the city pressed against glass. The office HVAC made the same indifferent noise it always did. The elevator dinged, and the world rearranged itself. Word had leaked that a client with an old kind of capital would be arriving that afternoon. Elias Rourke was the kind of man people described in hushed, respectful tones. Old wealth, precise in his tastes, a hand that knew what to hold and when to withdraw. He did not buy influence, he recognized lineage. To people like him, a ring could be a map. By mid-afternoon, the office smelled like cold coffee and the slight ozone scent of electronics. Leela rehearsed an offhand victory posture in front of the window. Richard watched his daughter's rehearsal like an audience that keeps clapping after the joke is already dead. Rebecca felt the tilt, the way a room leans towards the person who owns the narrative. He arrived in an understated way. He was smaller than his reputation suggested, the kind of man whose presence was more in effect than an entrance. He wore a coat that looked like it had been engineered to be unremarkable, and a pocket square that was a private joke. He carried no entourage. The man who moves through wealth quietly has fewer hands in his service. Rebecca met him in the hallway because her path cut across his. She had just turned a corner towards the service elevator, files under her arm, her security badge clicking like a metronome. The lobby had a smell of polished stone, and the faint, respectful hush of visitors not used to the firm's internal vocabulary. He stopped mid-step when he saw the ring. For a moment he was a photograph whose shutter had jammed on surprise. He did not widen his eyes, did not make spectacle. He simply slowed as if the air had the density of memory. His hand went up, not touching the ring, but hovering an inch from it, like a priest acknowledging a relic. "That ring," he said, his voice like an account balanced at last, "is Hson." Rebecca closed her mouth around the reply. The man had said the name as if it were a key. "It was his," she said, "my father." He did not press, but his pause contained deliberation. People like Elias Rourke are catalogers of history. They name patterns we assume to be random. "Where is he now?" he asked. She wished she could say with some tidy cadence that he was in a place where questions were no longer necessary. Rebecca had no tidy cadence. She had, instead, years of habit. Measurements, documents, ledgers, the way things looked when they had been arranged by someone with a conservative hand. "He disappeared," she said.
11 years ago. The elevator door dinged and closed on a small conversation. Rook's look was not pity, it was recognition. He nodded as if that answered some metric in his mind. "I should like to talk," he said, leaving the sentence incomplete, and therefore tremendously consequential. 2 things happened within minutes of that exchange. The scheduled strategy meeting was abruptly called off. People in the hallway who had been gossiping about the day's coffee began to look at each other sideways. And the rumor mill, that well-honed machine of corporate myth-making, clicked into place. Rebecca returned to her desk. The room seemed to toast itself against an unseen cold. Phones chimed, discreet messages sailed across secure channels, and the average hum of keyboards began to sound like a chorus of animals. It was like a weather system, a pressure front moving in. She did what she had always done when a weather system approached a city she was trying to govern. She built a map and read it. Her terminal was a closed, secure station, the kind of machine you don't plug casually into during a rumor circle. The screen's login prompt was bland, a bureaucratic face. She typed her credentials with her thumb on the ring, because touching the gold had become a habit that reduced the room of her mind to a single steady square. She pulled up encrypted channels she rarely used, unless the night darkened and the company needed careful tending. Messages came in fragments. A compliance officer flagged an old clause in a contract nobody thought relevant anymore. An associate on the legal team sent a scanned page of a founding document with one line underlined and a note, "Is this still valid?" The underlined clause read, dry and technical, like a bent legal reed. In the event that a named heir shall present proof of direct lineage, certain protections and activation clauses may be invoked to prevent hostile dilution of legacy assets. Rebecca read it twice. Her thumb moved along the band as if it were a button to unlock an older machine. She had read clauses like this once before in the midnight years, when she worked through misfiled filings. The clause's language had the brittle clarity of a promise written to survive corporate calculus, a non-dilutable proviso, formed under conditions that required verification of heir and signature of the original founder. That was all the beginning of an arc. How the arc bent depended on who noticed and what they noticed. Outside her office, whispers eddied. Inside, she started her quiet engine. She opened a secure line to a contact at a private registry in Geneva, the sort of place that catalogued corporate artifacts, and kept vaults with dust that smelled like silence. She typed in a coded phrase, the kind of shorthand people used when bureaucracy had to be clandestine rather than theatrical. Her fingers were steady.
She called a lawyer she trusted by nickname and used a sequence of phrases that meant verify lineage without setting off the firm's internal alert trellis. The lawyer's voice, when it came on the line, was a low thing that recognized the protocol. "If it's Hson," he said, "you understand what that clause could do." "I do," Rebecca replied. She did not speak the word power. She did not have to. The word hovered like a shadow. Meanwhile, the office's rumor market did what rumor markets do best. It amplified without context. The elevator lobby became a lounge of speculation. Someone suggested in a small conspiratorial whisper that Hson's heir might trigger a clause that would shutter some of the firm's risk assets. Another said that a billionaire client could pull his capital if the house smelled of dishonor. The more ridiculous the theory, the more it propagated. A junior analyst, overhearing a snippet, messaged the firm's investment desk a query. "If an heir shows up, do we have to disclose?" The investment desk replied with a sanitized legalese line, "Pending counsel." No one noticed Rebecca's hand steady on the ring when the first notices arrived. People did not notice the thing that never wanted notice until it was useful to be noticed. Elias Rourke moved like a weather system. He did not make public pronouncements. He made small adjustments. He asked a discreet question in the hallway that a person with power can ask without making a spectacle. Would there be any complications if the founder's heir, legitimately, asserted a claim? That question was the equivalent, in the language of corporations, of pulling a plug to test the water pressure. Richard Lang, who had engineered Leela's presence in the firm with the precise arithmetic of someone who equated family with brand extension, suddenly felt air in his ears. He made a joke about process and risk, the kind of joke that is a verbal fender for a car running too fast down a hill. His smile was a practice thing. But people who have been around long enough recognize the tone of a joke that is not a joke. Chairwoman Delgado arranged her schedule into a cold geometry. She had been the kind of executive who had learned to hear noise and distinguish the low, dangerous pitch that required hard, immediate attention. The meeting, which was not a meeting, convened in the boardroom, because that is where sanctions live. The white leather chairs were arranged like the points of a quiet court. The founder himself, Malcolm Brand, who had left the day-to-day to others but kept an institutional memory that tasted of iron and old paper, was called in because old men with institutional memory smell danger like wolves smell scent. He came not to save, but to witness, and to be the archive of what would be said. Rebecca did not speak at the boardroom door. She had no need to. She watched from the outer ring of the room, as if observing a surgical theater from across the divider.
Her role was to know the infrastructure, where the sealed documents were likely stored, how many signatories were required to move certain funds, which corporate governance rules would apply. She had memorized the building's policies like they were psalms. Chairwoman Delgado tapped the table with a single long finger, the way a concert conductor taps before the orchestra. "We received a communication," she said. Her voice had the swiftness of a blade. "Mr. Rourke requested a private conversation. There are questions about the founder's legacy." There was a brief silence, like a held breath. Then the murmurs resumed, the ones that said, in different dialects, that this had better be contained. Richard Lang, whose portfolio had been built in part on family placement, felt the floor of his predicaments rearrange. He smiled, but his smile was a machine trying to keep itself lubricated. Elias Rourke did not make threats. He made a discretionary move that carried more weight. He requested a review. He insisted, politely, that the firm produce documentation verifying the status of the founder's holdings and the terms that govern them. For people like Rourke, who had learned the difference between someone asking and someone insisting, the language of review was the language of leverage. Rebecca watched each face as they processed the word. The founder's ledger, the vault in Geneva, the clause about heirs. These were all terms of a contract that had been drafted when the firm still carried more than one kind of mythology. Documents have the limber cruelty of the law. They can be unreal, unread, and yet still binding. She walked back to her desk and did the things people do when preparing for a boardroom that might break a narrative. She pulled up the secure channels again and sent an encrypted message to a contact in Geneva. She used a protocol that would not flag the firm's internal systems, because the last thing she wanted was for Lang to think someone was starting a public spectacle. Confirm holdings under Hson, she typed in a shorthand that meant, find the signed notarized copy, archive reference LX7, and tag me. In the margins of the message, she added, if verified, deliver chain of custody and contact courier for sealed delivery. Roger, the Geneva contact wrote back in terse reply, working. She engaged the lawyer again. The lawyer suggested formal steps, a verification of lineage, a notarized chain of custody, and most importantly, a sealed presentation to the board. It was a procedural hammer that required time that the firm might not have if someone decided the public would like to speculate. Rebecca's fingers hovered over the keyboard just long enough to feel the ring's weight. She thought of her father's voice in fragments, like a cassette with a broken track. He had given her the ring when the world looked like it might breathe out consequences.
He had told her, in private, about a clause tucked into a drawer of contracts that he had insisted on, a visibility clause that would wake if the air surfaced. He had told her not to use it for vanity. You understand what this means? The lawyer asked over the secure line. Yes, she said. She did not say the word that lived behind the clause, control, because control was a thing many people confused with vindication. She had never wanted to be vindicated in the way corporate dramas use that word. She wanted the ledger to be correct. In the corridor, Leela flounced past, oblivious to the quiet architecture being assembled. She stopped at a cluster of junior associates and performed a small debriefing of her own, about branding and image, and how a ring of little value could be made into a narrative if one leaned hard enough. It's all optics, she said. Don't let these old stories drag the firm into nostalgia. Optics, the room had decided, was the business it wanted to learn. They did not yet understand the depth of the document they were about to awaken. Rebecca's inbox pinged. A courier had been contacted. The kind of courier who handled sealed legal packages with customs protocols and temperature controls, and a form of seriousness that made people adjust their tie. The message was small. Courier dispatched for sealed document. ETA 45 minutes. 45 minutes is a long time in a room full of people constructing futures on brittle spreadsheets. It is an eternity for gossip. For Rebecca, 45 minutes was a window. It was also a point at which the firm had to decide whether to treat anything as sacred. She walked the perimeter of the office, eyes scanning the cluster of faces. Someone had left a coffee cup with 2 lipstick marks in a manager's meeting area. An analyst had stuck a color-coded post-it on a terminal. Little signals. She cataloged them in her head the way a conductor cues the unsung instruments. No movement was wasted. In her memory, fragments slotted into place. The day Edmund had folded the pledge, his handwriting cramped and legalistic, and the way he'd spoken the words, if you ever need to be known. She'd worn a ring as a means of being known in that very particular, private sense. Now the ring was a key. She did not revel in the idea of pulling a lever that would drop the house of cards. She moved like someone who carried an instrument for measurement, not incendiary. At the far end of the office, a single intern had the courage to whisper a rumor aloud, that Mr. Rourke meant pull his accounts if the firm crossed a line. The rumor, like a wet match, was small and smelled of sulfur. It spread. People moved to their windows. The floor felt like a boat with a slow leak. I heard a chuckle from Leela near the coffee machine. Watch out, Leela said to a fellow director with the delighted cruelty of an influencer. Think of the stunt possibilities. Stunt possibilities, Rebecca thought. She could almost measure the moment in metrics of vanity. Vanity was the province of people who could not imagine that procedural truth might one day overwind their stories. When the courier called at the reception desk, his voice was professional in the way of someone who had sent and received packages that changed hands between boardrooms and vaults, and the kind of clients who insisted on initials rather than names. He had with him a packet wrapped in wax and twine, anachronistic, theatrical, exactly the thing that makes procedural narrative sticky. He was asked to wait in the anteroom while verification proceeded. The receptionist made him fill out a manifest, and she asked for an ID that read like a bank book. He produced a small laminated card with Geneva seals and a code. The receptionist's fingers moved like someone who had done this 1,000 times, and had learned that small courtesies buy larger ones. He signed the clipboard and noted sealed, and his watch told him precisely when to be in the room. Rebecca watched the man through the glass of the anteroom as if his hands were a barometer. The man placed his packet on a small tray, and the tray was carried through the doors into the white leather boardroom the way a minor relic enters a temple. Inside, the board members sat differently now. The founder rubbed his thumb against his knuckle, a precise, habitual motion that made him look older in a way that was not wholly unkind. Chairwoman Delgado asked the receptionist for the courier's manifest, and then passed it along to a lawyer whose face had deepened into professional interest. Rebecca remained outside, on the periphery, watching reactions like an archivist reading marginalia in a book that was about to be opened. The elevator light glowed, and the building hummed with its usual indifferent efficiency. You could feel it. The firm was holding its breath. Something heavier than rumor had arrived. The courier's wax seal bore a crest that looked like a compass rose. It had the feel of a document that had been born in climates of both cold and tact. The man who unwrapped it was a lawyer with hands that did not tremble. He moved with the precision of someone who had once sat at a long table with other people and made small notations that later detonated reputations. Inside, the parchment was more than parchment. It was a set of folded papers, a notary seal, a series of signatures that traced back to a London bureau and a Geneva vault. On the first page, in a careful, mechanical hand, was the name Edmund Hson, followed by a notated clause, a legacy provision that had been filed and shelved and forgotten because when money moves, people prefer the present tense. "Is this authenticated?" someone asked. The voice was the one that comes when a sentence needs to be physically anchored. The lawyer placed a single file on the table and tapped it.
"Preliminary verification indicates the archival stamps are authentic," he said. The room inhaled. Back in her office, Rebecca closed her hands over the ring. She could feel the metal warm under her skin. She thought of the many small, quiet choices that had led to this point. Editing minutes at 2 a.m, fixing a mislabel on a ledger, speaking only when necessary. She thought of the old man's wrinkled handwriting and the way his eyes held a map. There were faces in that boardroom that would not like what came next. There were names on spreadsheets that had been reliant on opacity and the assumption that certain families could be moved like pieces on a board. They would fight, if they could, with the sort of procedural motions people fight with, motions and delays and appeals to process. Those are the arms businesses use to prop up artifice. Rebecca did not want to be the instrument of ruin. She wanted, in the old-fashioned way she had practiced, for the world to be correctly accounted. The receptionist closed the door softly behind the courier. The murmurs inside the boardroom roiled like low thunder. On a thin gray afternoon, the sound of paper unfolded like weather. Rebecca moved her hand from her ring to a small drawer, not out of theatrics but habit. In the drawer lay an old photograph of her father with a ledger open and ink on his fingers. She put it back. Someone in the boardroom cleared his throat with the practiced dryness of cultivated panic. "We need to assemble council," he said. "We need to vote on whether to open this now or to move the preparations under advisement." The votes were not yet cast. The decision about whether to treat a document as the trigger for institutional action would be made over coffee and signatures and legal opinions. Rebecca stepped out of the office and walked with measured steps toward the boardroom door. She walked into the hallway just as the first of the junior analysts began to whisper an analysis about what the clause could do in optimism. "Non-dilutable," he said. "That could stop any hostile buyout." Another voice, older, laughed the kind of small, brittle laugh you use when you want to sound like you understand leverage. "That clause is a relic. Plenty of things look enforceable until you litigate for the next 5 years." Rebecca stopped outside the boardroom and listened. She was used to listening. Her life at the firm had taught her to let language breathe until the words lost their theater and became instruments. Now, words were starting to move toward motions. Malcolm Brandt was the first to speak when the door opened and he stepped out to the anteroom to let fresh air sweep into the boardroom. His eyes met Rebecca's with something like an apology and an inventory. He did not loudly invite her in. He knew the protocols in the theater. He also knew the ledger mattered more than the appearance of order. "Miss Hson," he said quietly.
"If you are willing." "I am," she said. The room rearranged itself around the fact of her willingness. Leela flushed, half with triumph, half with the instinctive fear of being displaced. Richard Lang folded his hands as if to hide the way his fingers clenched. Elias Rourke remained unshowy. The word caution was a legal bumper, an instrument deployed to keep actions from looking theatrical. Rebecca sat. Her ring felt cool once more. The parchment sat on the table like a small gravitational body. She did not look triumphant. She did not look victimized. She looked like someone who had been called upon to supply a fact. As the lawyers sorted through the documentation,
As the board set its protocols in place, Rebecca felt a lift in the air over the office that felt like the beginning of a storm and the end of complacency. There was something perfectly corporate about the way the end of things begins. Agendas, minutes, motions, votes. Revolutions in business often present themselves as paperwork. When the decision was made, preliminary verification accepted, chain of custody acknowledged, someone in the boardroom suggested that Rourke's client representative might wish to be present for the review. Rourke did not require invitations for things he cared about. He simply made them known in a way that made attendance likely. He appeared in the doorway as if the chemistry of the room had been the invisible road he had been walking. He regarded the ring on Rebecca's hand across the table with the casual interest of a man who had recognized a symbol and was deciding whether to weigh it in the palm of his hand. "I did not come expecting," he said softly, "for this to be so tidy." "Tidiness," Rebecca said, "is not what brought us here. The document did." He nodded. "Documents have a way of arranging dishes on the table." He gestured to the parchment. "Sometimes the dishes are heavier than anyone expects." Her ring felt like ballast. Outside, the office continued its low hum. The rumor machine revved. People sharpened their mechanized responses. The board agreed to take the matter under immediate legal oversight, and the decision was taken to bring in an external registrar to verify the signatures at the Geneva vault. It was a procedural cascade: verification, temporary hold on certain asset movements pending review, a board vote to appoint special counsel. None of it happened in a moment. It happened in measured, legal steps, each one a hinge. Leela starred with a mouth like a fish that had been offered a different sea. Richard's jaw tightened like a hinge someone had left slightly rusted. Malcolm's eyes had the weary light of someone who had been watching an old house settle for 20 years and had suddenly heard the sound of a foundation shifting. Rebecca sat back as if she were the only person in the room who had a map. She did not smile. She had never learned to take pleasure in the collapsing of others. She'd learned to measure outcomes. When the last lawyer left to call the registrar, when the chairwoman closed the small, leather-bound vote book and said the words, "motion carried," with the same kind of fulcrum as a sentence that tipped a scale, Rebecca felt the room's weight shift. There would be inquiries, audits, and meetings. There would be a small friction of reputations and an inevitable reshuffling. The firm would try to align itself to the new reality. People would choose sides. They always do. Rebecca returned to her desk. She logged into her secure terminal and sent a quiet note to her contact in Geneva. Expected ETA for verified documents. She watched the message go, and then watched the little typing bubble appear. The reply was patient and procedural. Courier at check-in, ETA to office, 17 minutes. We will proceed with chain of custody verification upon physical presentation. 17 minutes. The breath in the office tightened. In the anteroom, the courier adjusted his gloves. He smoked no cigarettes. People who carry old documents do not smoke in the way that makes them less precise. He checked his manifest. The wax seal sat like a small relic, intact. He had been trained to know that wax is a site of drama. It is also a hinge of authenticity. Rebecca felt something like an expectation coil in her chest. For years she had accepted that being invisible was a position of intelligence. Invisibility protected you from spectacle, but there are times when visibility is necessary, times when the ledger needs to meet the light. The minutes ticked in the boardroom like a clock winding down. People looked at their watches. Leela practiced a smile that felt smaller in the presence of formal procedure. It is hard to perform entitlement when a clause sits like a small model of possible consequences. Rebecca sat with her hands folded, with the ring warm under her thumb. The things she had quietly put into motion, a phone call, a coded message, a legal sequence, were now moving like the quiet machinery beneath a building preparing for inspection. The courier knocked, polite and rhythmic. The receptionist answered with a practiced civility that was now threaded with suspense. The man handed over the physical manifest, and the boardroom lawyer compared the seal to a scanned archive copy. The wax bore the crest and the compass rose that matched the reference number Rebecca had called hours earlier. Inside the boardroom, a lawyer made a small, precise statement. We have physical delivery of archival packet LX7 from Geneva, sealed and consistent with registered provenance. Rebecca exhaled in the way people exhale when a process begins to articulate itself. The room seemed to hold for a beat, like a photograph suspended before the shutter clicked. Outside, the city pressed on. Inside, paper and law were beginning to move like tectonic plates. The courier left the room with the signature and a nod. He did not look back. That was not his job. He had passed a package from one place to another. The rest, he knew, was instruments and counting. Rebecca placed her fingers against the ring and allowed herself the small, private knowledge that she had kept it for reasons more than sentiment. The ring was a simple gold band, as unassuming as a coin in a quiet pocket. It had been worn for 11 years through grays and small mercies. It had a capacity to be recognized. That recognition had power because it mapped to documents, signatures, and a founder's deliberate precaution. This was not luck, it was a vector. She thought of the many small ways the firm had been built on unspoken assumptions, familial appointments, a culture that confused presence with merit, the small prerogatives given to the visible and gaudy. She thought of Leela's laugh and Richard's complacency, and the way the firm had learned to navigate opacity as if it were water. There was a soft knock at the boardroom door. The chairwoman rose, moving with the governance people move with, slow, patient, full of the kind of power that did not need to shout. "Prepare the registry verification," she said, "and seal the room." They would seal the room. They would schedule the registrar's arrival and make the calls that would put independent verification on the table. They would call counsel, and counsel would call their own counsel. They would move with the measured efficiency the room required when it had to unmake an accident of privilege. Rebecca listened to each step like an instrument. She did not gloat. She did not gesture. She had not sought spectacle. But she had sought in this firm for a decade, and she had kept her hand steady. She had kept a ring on the finger that would one day make a paper matter. The ring was not a trophy. It was evidence. As the boardroom locked its doors and the registrar was called, Rebecca felt the floor shift beneath the company in small procedural increments. That shift would not be immediate, but it would be inevitable. Outside, Leela checked her reflection and repatterned her hair. Inside, the legal machinery turned. In the center of it all, a plain gold band rested on a steady hand. The rumor mill would have to find a new thing to feed on. The firm would have to answer to exacting questions it had not anticipated. Rebecca stood and smoothed the front of her skirt. She did not wish for a chair on the board. She did not want revenge to be her name. She wanted, as she had always wanted, for the accounts to be righted and for the policies to be consistent. She wanted the accounts righted and the policies consistent. That was the truth she could hold without theatricality. The board would do what boards do: vote, record, and try to convert chaos into minutes.
But procedure is also a kind of justice when it's wielded with clarity, and clarity was what the room was slowly learning to prefer. The registrar arrived with a quiet efficiency that made the theatrical wax wrapper from Geneva look quaint. He unpacked the sealed folio under the scrutiny of 3 lawyers and the chairwoman. Under a light that made the parchment fibers look like the grain in an old table, he ran authentication numbers against the vault's registry, stamped dates against signatures, and traced chain of custody entries that stopped being a dry detail and began to read like a timeline of responsibility. "It's genuine," he said simply. His phrase landed like a score settling into place. There was no triumph in his voice, only the small satisfaction of an office that had done its job correctly. Chairwoman Delgado did not allow sentiment. She let procedure make the music. "Given the registry verification," she said, her syllables exact, "we will place the affected accounts under temporary restriction until counsel concludes an independent review. We will appoint special counsel and notify relevant stakeholders under privilege." The language was careful and effective. Temporary restriction is the corporate equivalent of lowering the drawbridge. It is not confiscation, it is containment. It buys time for a rigorous accounting. Elias Work did not go to the microphones. He made decisions without spectacle. He notified his representatives to place the firm's commitments on conditional hold. The message, delivered with the calm of a person closing a book, was simple. Capital that might be exposed by malfeasance will be restricted until the situation is resolved. It was not a dramatic flourish. It was leverage, precise and unshowy, but infinitely effective in a market that trades on certainty. At that tiny, precise motion, ripples turned into currents. The investment desk, who had spent months modeling hairline risks, translated the hold into immediate sensitivity tests. The Treasury Department ran contingency models and found, with the mechanical cruelty of an algorithm, that certain projects would be cash-constrained if external capital paused for more than a fortnight. Language that had been abstract in pre-meeting memos now had numbers attached to it, and those numbers made center-left chairs in the room fidget. Richard Lang found some new shade in his smile. He attempted an institutionalism move that read like a practice script. Motions to review procedures, calls for delay while counsel examined counting methods. Process, he said, as if repeating the word many times could lubricate a new narrative. He had spent years steering optics, now he attempted to steer time. But process can be used to delay, and it can equally be used to accelerate. This room chose acceleration. Delgado called for a vote on immediate suspension of any executives with a direct nexus to decisions surrounding the affected accounts. The motion was clinical. Votes were cast. The tally was more decisive than Richard had preferred.
For Richard, the floor dropped from under some small set of assumptions. The board voted to place him on temporary leave pending the independent audit. The motion did not adjudicate guilt. It only rid the firm of a conflict of interest while outside counsel did its work. There was procedural courtesy in the way they removed him. Not a public shaming, but a legal shell to make further steps legitimate. Leela, whose act had been built on performance, found herself suddenly naked in a space where performance was not currency. She had practiced being seen, for cameras, for clients, for patrons, never for the low-seated rituals of governance. The firm required one thing now that it hadn't asked for before: quiet accountabilities. She had nothing to offer but noise. They asked her to surrender her client-facing access pending review. It was a professional strip-down, loss of roles, reassignment to an internal project with tight supervision, and an HR-led conversation about conduct. Security escorted her from the floor, not like a scene in which someone was hauled out in cuffs, but like a person being guided off stage after a curtain call gone wrong. She protested, perfumed indignation spilling in phrases meant to shame others for ruining a branding moment. Nobody listened for long. Her exit was not dramatic. It was more like a television set losing a lead. The lights dimmed. The production moved on. For someone who had built a persona on visibility, the void of being unseen was exquisite and devastating in equal measure. The room, which had earlier laughed at thrift shop chic, now watched the artifact of entitlement exit under polite escort. Her act was not physically destroyed. It was administratively dismantled. Accusations began to find purchase within the firm's files. Small irregularities the compliance team had been flagging across months now read like signposts rather than exceptions. Late approvals, unusual routing of contracts, and a handful of documents that bore signatures without needing minutes matched up into an uncomfortable constellationary shape. The special counsel circled those notes with a professional hunger, not to gloat, but to assemble the chain of responsibility. People began to send tentacle apologies in subject lines. Others sent defensive memos. A few sent quiet plaintive notes to their mentors. An assistant who had once laughed at Leela's joke now sat hands folded, watching the legal team cross-reference date stamps. Accountability is an arithmetic subject. When you begin to add up misalignments, discrepancies become liabilities. Elias Rourke, who had arrived as a discreet client, began to function as an accelerant for institutional honesty. He offered to underwrite the cost of the independent registrar and the special counsel's expedited review. He did not do it for spectacle. He did it because capital likes to sleep well.
The firm accepted with gratitude and the opprobrium of those who had been counting on opacity. Rebecca, who had remained quiet at every turn, was not asked to gloat. Her work continued as if it were an undercurrent to the more showy motions. She produced documentation, verified signatures, and traced back ledgers. She met the registrar in a side room to go over the archival indexes, recited off references like one might recite street names in a city one knows by habit. Her mind worked like a decent engine, steady, efficient, and designed to make a building's systems run. In one of the many small rooms where the firm now housed its urgent work, a junior analyst presented a troubling finding. He had cross-checked an internal ledger against client-facing accounts and found a tranche of funds that, under normal trusteeship rules, should have been routed differently. It did not shout malfeasance, the way tabloids imagine, but it said plainly, irregular approvals, poor record-keeping, and several instances where governance lines had been deliberately skirted. That phrase, deliberately skirted, would be the hinge for many conversations. It's a careful, non-accusatory articulation that leaves room for a defense while making the board and counsel take the facts seriously. The special counsel wrote to the board requesting immediate access to certain folders and sign-off logs, and noted that preliminary findings suggested procedural negligence at minimum and plausible conflicts of interest at scale. The firm braced. Board meetings multiplied in frequency. The firm that had once measured days by quarterly goals now measured hours by counsel memos. Malcolm Brand watched the machinery with a face that had been softened by years, but still retained the rigor of someone who had founded a structure and now feared its decay. He spoke rarely, but when he did, his words carried the weight of a man who knew how institutions aged. Whatever fault there is, he said in a particular private conversation with Rebecca, must be met and corrected. The house stands or it does not. She heard that not as a patriarchal admonition, but as a technical problem to be solved. He corrected the ledger. She would see that it was corrected with the minimum of theatrical suffering. As the forensic review progressed, a few things became clear enough to announce within the firm. Richard Lang had exercised improvised approvals that bypassed standard multi-signatory requirements, and several initiatives had been staffed in ways that limited internal scrutiny. The language of bypass and limited scrutiny was carefully chosen by counsel to avoid premature judgment, but the implication traveled quickly. Richard attempted to mobilize allies. He sent emails reminding certain directors of historical precedents. He made calls, polite, urgent, asking for meetings.
But the thing about a board moving in a particular direction is that momentum becomes its own ally.
Once the plane of consequence has been set, it is much harder to retrofit the scenery to a previous scene. Within 2 days, the board convened a vote on Richard's continued executive status. The vote was not a purge, it was a protective action to shield the firm from conflicts of interest while the independent audit finished its work. They placed him on administrative leave pending the results. The minutes recorded the motion, and the motion recorded the votes. The firm that had previously favored opacity now preferred the hard practicality of transparency. Leela's dismissal from client-facing duties was followed by an HR sanction, a formal reprimand, and a requirement for retraining and supervision. It was not the spectacular sacking of her social fantasies, but it was the unraveling of the career scaffolding she'd relied upon. That unraveling, while bureaucratic, spoke louder than any public shaming could. There were no sirens and there were no dramatic arrests. There were minutes and counsel recommendations, and an independent registrar whose checklists read like a slow, inevitable tide. That tide changed lives anyway. Institutions have power precisely because their effects are slow and inexorable. Through it all, Rebecca kept to her habit of doing what had to be done without grandstanding. She supplied the documents the registrar requested, including an annotated ledger that traced any unusual approvals to their signatories. She did not produce the ledger to shame people. She presented it as a factual map. The maps don't care about motives. Motives are for historians and journalists. Maps are for judges and auditors. The moment of public declaration came in a press release more spare and careful than the firm usually used. It said nothing sensational. It disclosed that certain executive decisions were being reviewed, that an independent audit was underway, and that the firm had engaged external counsel to ensure fiduciary standards were upheld. It emphasized cooperation and conformance to governance. It did not name people. Outside, the press, hungry for storylines, framed it in simpler terms. Headlines wanted villains and heroes. The internal emails to those who read them told a different story, the firm's messy effort to convert its cultural rot into something remediable. Board members were pressured from outside shareholders. External funds called for accountability and for a seat at the table until the audit concluded. It is an odd fact about capital that its desire for stability often yields the precise rigidity institutions need to right themselves. In this case, money's discomfort with uncertainty became a lever to force governance. The worst of the spectacle passed quickly, but its consequences did not. People left voluntarily, some were asked to go. The firm shut down certain initiatives that had been incubated under thin approval structures. It reinstated multi-signatory thresholds.
Compliance staff were expanded and given greater authority. Training programs on conflict of interest were mandated. The company rewired its internal architecture in small, expensive ways. Throughout, Malcolm Brandt moved with the deliberate pace of a man arranging his own legacy. The founder met with the chairwoman and with the lawyers and with Rebecca in private. He knew the ring was not simply a piece of metal. It was a symbol of a pledge he had made to a colleague and friend, and to a set of principles he claimed to have built into the firm's early contracts. "Do you want anything out of this?" he asked Rebecca once in his office, where the light found the wood grain to be generous. She considered the question as she usually considered questions about reward, analytically. The thought of a board seat or executive authority had never been appealing to her because it confounded her sense of remedy with an appetite for theater. She had borne witness to the way power snacks on promise. She had no eagerness for that. "I want the ledger to be true," she said. "I want the company to stop implying that presence equals merit." Brandt nodded with the tired, conciliatory motion of someone who'd watched the very things he built corrode. "If you want," he began, then stopped, the sentence dissolving into a space where habit meets choice. They offered her a chair on a newly constituted oversight committee. It was an important role, authority paired with audit, the power to demand third-party verifications, the ability to appoint compliance officers directly. Many would consider it the moral summit of corporate influence. But saviors rarely change institutions as effectively as rigid, boring rules do. Rebecca thanked him and declined. The room was small and still when she explained her reasoning. "I don't want to be the spectacle of a fix," she said. "I'll do the work. I already do the work. Putting me on the main stage would make people think this is about me. It's not about me." Brandt looked at her as if he were measuring the sharpness of a tool. "You will be listened to regardless," he said. "If that's the case," she replied, "then the instruments we've built will carry it. The firm needs a trustee who is independent, not a new figurehead. The ring doesn't make that person me." He understood. He had not expected her to accept a chair. He had offered it because many people assume stewardship is appeased by appointments.
Instead, she performed a different act of stewardship. She placed the ring on the founder's hand with the casual formality of closing a book. "Keep it safe," she said, "but not for you." He looked at the ring for a long moment. The gold band caught the light, modest and stoic. "I will set up a trust," he said finally, "with an independent oversight council and an external trustee. That will preserve the clause's intent without concentrating symbolic power on an individual." Rebecca's expression did not change.
"Make sure it's independent," she said. "Make sure the paperwork isn't just window dressing." He promised he would. It was not a promise that fixed everything, but it was a step that required machinery rather than spectacle. She had no desire for a throne. She wanted an instrument that would not rust. On the day the board announced its interim changes, a set of careful, legally vetted motions, Leela's professional life had been pared back to an internal assignment under supervision. Richard's leave was recorded in the minutes. The firm announced it would fund a long, independent audit and invited a coalition of stakeholders to observe the work. The press called it a shakeup. Insiders called it correction. For Rebecca, the corrective work wasn't a headline. She resumed her old tasks with a new context. Her emails were still precise, her fixes still surgical. But the small things she did had now become part of the firm's remediation plan. She trained new compliance hires. She answered hard questions with the coolness of someone who had been making this paperwork into habit for years. She pushed for independent verification wherever possible. Elias Rourke's role receded in the public narrative. He had intervened in the way someone with capital and taste intervenes, calm, decisive, and not for praise. He withdrew his public statements and let the joint efforts proceed. For a while, his name was mentioned in corridor gossip as the quietly decisive factor. Then the firm allowed itself the work of consequence instead of celebrity. Malcolm Brand arranged the trust, with layers of counsel and an external trustee whose credentials were impeccable. It was not the theatrical solution that Leela had hoped for, that is, a patron who would anoint a successor. Instead, the band became a legal artifact kept with procedural integrity, a box and a safety deposit with a trustee and a schedule that required audits before any activation. The founder adopted a small, bureaucratic guardianship that insulated the firm from momentary whims. On her last day in the office before a brief leave she had scheduled, part habit, part need to recalibrate, Rebecca walked through the same hallways where the rumor mill had once spun faster than the elevators. The air felt different. People spoke in shorter sentences. They used fewer performative superlatives. Meetings opened with agendas and minutes and ended with deliverables. She passed the stairwell where she had once sat late at night making lists. A junior analyst paused her as she walked by. "Miss Hson," the analyst said, timid with that particular mix of reverence and curiosity. "Thank you for making sure it's true." Rebecca looked at the analyst as if she had been given a tool that could be measured. "Do the work," she said, "and document it." The analyst smiled in a way that suggested she would. Outside the building, the city leaned in its habitual ways. Financial headlines smoldered for a day or two, then moved on.
The firm began to clean its house. A narrative of correction replaced the instant pleasure of scandal. As for Leela, the spectacle she had cultivated had been exposed as brittle. Her brand opportunities shrank. She was still young enough that some doors would reopen if she proved willing to learn. She had to decide whether vanity could be traded for substance. Vanity, in the end, is expensive work. Richard's reputation suffered in ways letters couldn't fully repair. He had to answer to shareholders and to the legal process. It was not melodramatic ruin. It was a ledger that no longer balanced the same way it once had. Malcolm Brand kept the ring in the trust. He sent Rebecca a short note, a sentence that read like an old man's thank you, for keeping the ledger true. She did not reply with fanfare. She replied with the same small, precise competence that had guided her through the whole episode. She worked. The firm would never be the same, nor would it be the ruin some had predicted. Institutions adjust. They learn the hard arithmetic of governance, or they fail. This one rearranged itself with the clumsy, stubborn grace of a machine that had been taken apart and reassembled by those who knew its gears. Rebecca walked away from the building on a late afternoon that carried that particular clarity of light that makes glass look like something lifted from porcelain. She had not been an avenger. She had been an accountant of truth. She had not chosen spectacle. She declined the chair and accepted only the knowledge that the system had been nudged, not broken. As she stepped into the city, she felt for the first time in months the ring cool against her thumb. Its weight was the same as it had always been. Its purpose had been fulfilled, not by grand action,
but by the slow, coordinated work of documents and people who chose to do the right procedural thing. The firm would continue to face audits, shareholder questions, and press cycles. There would be lawsuits and settlements, and perhaps careers that never recovered. That was the nature of consequence: thorough, bureaucratic, and painfully fair. People would read the headlines and assign heroes and villains, but in the rooms where minutes were written, the story would be recorded for what it was: a correction inspired by a small band of gold, and a woman who had learned to hold what she needed to hold without becoming a symbol. She did not look back. That is not because she did not care. It is because she had aligned herself to a different rhythm. The world, she had discovered, often needs people who will do the unromantic work of correcting an account rather than the poetic work of seizing a chair. On the sidewalk, she paused, feeling the city turn like a huge ledger. Above, the light shifted. She tucked her hand into her coat and walked on. If you want more of these quiet corporate reckonings, subscribe. There are plenty more.